The reason I think that Rome continues to fascinate people right down to the modern day is that we're fortunate enough to have quite a lot of Roman ruins scattered across Europe. And that's one of the reasons why, wherever you go on a holiday in around the Mediterranean, it's kind of almost impossible not to trip over some Roman ruins somewhere or other. So there is that. The other thing I think is that, within our philosophical traditions, our political traditions, our traditions of mass culture and entertainment, Rome has always been front and central, whether it's the sword and sandals movies from the 1960s and beyond and before, or it's the slew of novels that have always been with us about ancient Rome. And there's also that kind of fascination of comparing the present to the past, because one of the things about Romans is they feel very, very contemporary sometimes when you're reading their letters or their histories or thinking about their graffiti or the way of life even, the plumbing, the mass entertainments, all sorts of things. So it's really a question of the Rome, I don't think, ever really left us. It's always been some sort of part of history that lurks at the foreground of our memory and constantly provides us with new ways to sort of reinterpret the past and also to interpret the present from the perspective of the past. And I think that's what creates the USP, if you like, of our interest in ancient Rome. Frankly, no, I would not have liked to have been born in ancient Rome. I'm far too addicted to some of the luxuries and pleasures of modern life to ever want to live in a city where life was brutish and short. People died of illnesses we can easily treat today, and also the grinding poverty for the vast majority of people. However, if I was forced, if somebody put a gun to my head and said, you've got to go back to ancient Rome, pick your character who you want to be, it's a no-brainer. I want to be Emperor of Rome. As for the battle scenes, yeah, it's a tricky one, this, because I am a writer of a historical fiction, and it's called fiction for a reason, and that's why we have to use our imagination as writers and also as readers in order to conjure up the battle scenes that I write about and readers recreate in their own heads. And I think part of the ability to do that is I've had a sort of lifelong fascination with military history, military weaponry and so on, and reading about the practical elements of research that people like Peter Connolly was so famous for. And if you put all that together and a fairly active imagination, you can construct these scenes that have a realistic feel to them, and at the same time recreating something that none of us really could experience in the same way that military action took place in the ancient past. Things have moved on so much that it's almost impossible to recreate accurately, but we give it our best shot as historians and as historical fiction writers, and I'm sure readers give it their best shot as imaginative readers. Gosh, well, there's so many characters to choose from. Obviously, Macro and Cato would be a lot of fun to spend time with, but then again, I spend a lot of time with them anyway in my head when I'm writing the books. So if it had to be somebody else that I've written about in this time, it would be probably someone like Narcissus, because I'd be fascinated to find out, the ins and outs of running the empire and sort of flattering emperors to do the kinds of things that they need to do. So someone like Narcissus or a villain like Vitellius would be fun. Well, I prepare by doing a lot of research. I mean, as you can probably see from the books in the background, that's just the ongoing project pile. So I tend to read a heck of a lot of historical works and also political works sometimes, because quite often they reference the ancient world, and ancient world politics is probably one of the best forms of public entertainment there was. You know, the admission was free and the blood was real. You know, so always quite fascinating. I also try, as far as possible, to go to places where the books are set, speak to reenactors, and basically immerse myself as much as possible in the world that I'm writing about. And there's no set time for how long this takes. It just gets to a point where I feel like I have built up a momentum of knowledge, and I know what the plot is, and then I can just launch straight into it and get on with the book. One of the things I'm very, very reluctant to do is to force that knowledge that I've picked up as part of the research onto the reader. There are plenty of writers who do this thing where they kind of info dump, and I tend to try to trust the reader that if there's something I refer to that they don't understand, that they'll go away and look it up themselves, or they already know it. I think a lot of people are quite knowledgeable about ancient Rome, so a lot of the work is done in that respect. Yes, I often go to places where the books are set as part of my research, because I feel that sometimes it's impossible to capture the feel of a place unless you've been there in person and experienced what the climate feels like, what the various odours and smells feel like, what you can see in front of you, what you can physically feel and experience as much as possible. Which is why, for example, when I was writing books set in Egypt, I spent quite a lot of time there, and I can tell you how hot it gets very, very early in the morning, and just how massive some of the mosquitoes and other bugs are on the Nile. And when you kind of recreate that sense of what it's like, I think it's very, very hard to do that unless you've been to a place. Of course, you can't go to all the places that you set books, particularly these days when there's so much trouble in, for example, the Middle East. I was lucky that I did most of my research at a time when travel in the Middle East was fairly easy and risk-free. There was, I'm trying to remember which one it was now, forgive me, there are so many books I sometimes forget the titles, but there is one where Cato suffers from PTSD, or a Roman equivalent of it, because again it's a little bit easy to make kind of comparisons between modern ideas about things and the ancient world. PTSD didn't exist then, but I'm sure some form of it did. And that really took me to a very, very dark place. I did have some discussions with military veterans about the stresses and strains of prolonged soldiering, and particularly in high-octane environments like combat. And I tried to, as faithfully as possible, reproduce a lot of that in the book. And I did have a number of letters from veterans afterwards saying that, thanking me for it, and also for saying I've actually portrayed it quite well. But it wasn't easy to write about. No, I did not plan a very long series at the outset. I had in mind possibly as many as 10 books. I'm now writing the 24th, so you can see where that intention went. My agent said I'd probably be lucky if I got 6, and my publisher said, well, we'll see how the first 3 go and then see if we go any further than that. But nobody at the time had any idea that this was going to be the length of series that it is, and or to be honest, to be as remotely successful as the series has become. You know, given that it's been translated now into over 20 languages and sold, you know, millions of books around the world. But sometimes these things work out, you know, and I had faith in this series, and I think I'm glad my agents and publishers had the same faith. And ultimately, of course, the readers did too, and they've stuck through with the series, and I've gathered more of them along the way. So I'm really delighted, you know, that the way things panned out. And of course, I have to mention briefly here that I'm also Very, very grateful to Ridley Scott for releasing Gladiator in 2000 to act as the trailer for my first novel. Thanks, Ridley. I wrote the Romans series primarily for me because I had an abiding interest in historical fiction series, the longer the better, and one of my favourites was the Horatio Hornblower series by C.S. Forester. I'd also just started reading Lindsay Davis's excellent Falco detective novels, and what I wanted was a Hornblower type series set in ancient Rome, but looking at it from the kind of worm's eye view upwards, rather than so many of these books have been written about emperors and generals and so on, and I wanted to do it from the other end of the scale. So what I did was I looked for that sort of series. None existed at the time, so I thought, well, I'll write this one for me, and we'll see how it goes. So that's how that got started. As for other periods in history, I'm currently writing a series of crime series set in Germany during World War II. I've written about Napoleon and Wellington. History for me is the series, really, because that's where all the best stories are. That's where all the best tales about what's good and what's bad about humanity take place. So I have no particular abiding interest in one particular period. It tends to be across the whole sweep of history because, that's our story. That's the story of humanity. That's the, it gives us lessons, it gives us warnings, too few of which we take to heart as it happens, as we've seen, in the revival of certain political strands and brands in our contemporary history, which we really should have consigned to the dustbin of history, but they're back. And I think it becomes more imperative than ever to study and learn from history. So that's why I'm interested in the whole sweep of history and not a particular period. Well, I suppose the books that had most influence on me were the ones I probably started reading in childhood. Rosemary Sutcliffe, the author of the rather brilliant The Eagle of the Ninth, and if you haven't read it, I'd recommend that you do as quickly as possible, really brought home to me an interest in ancient Rome and a sense of what it might have been like to live in the province of Britannia. So she was a huge influence. And then, as I've mentioned before, C.S. Forester was one of my big influences as a teenager, and I devoured those novels and, kind of grew alongside Hornblower as I was reading the series, in much the same way that I think a lot of my readers have grown up with Macro and Cato. So those were the main influences on the writing front. In terms of just writing in general, there's a fantastic book by Dodie Smith called I Capture the Castle, which has the most stunning opening, I think, of any novel I've ever read. And it's something that taught me a lesson, which is that you really do need to capture the reader's attention as early as possible on the first page of your novel if you're going to sustain it through the course of the book. Too few writing courses, too few writing groups and too few writers, I think, emphasise that enough. The alternative sometimes is a kind of a woeful opening chapter that is a huge info dump, or as we say, sort of setting the scene, telling us all the stuff we need to know about the world we're in. You need to start with something quite striking, a striking image, a striking statement, a middle of some kind of action of some kind, and that's the best way to open a book. And Dodie Smith really sort of brought that home to me when I read I Capture the Castle. Haven't read it? Give it a chance.